What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Got a much shorter, simpler, easier, more digestible episode for you today, maybe than the 30-minute elongated version of yesterday's episode, which was definitely a little bit more of a deep dive into the Aaron Rodgers situation. I want to just kick things off by saying thank you, first of all, because I get when anytime you talk about Aaron Rodgers in just about any capacity, it is a very hot button topic. It is a divisive topic. Anytime you label a video that says it's time to trade Aaron Rodgers, you're usually going to catch some heat for that. So the fact that episode did about 94% likes and had a ton of great feedback, a ton of great comments. And a lot of people too that are just like, you know what, I'm not sure I agree, but I appreciate the way that you laid it out, and just like it was just totally fine, right? Like you don't have to agree with everything that I say. I do this 365 days a year. I'm going to go ahead and assume that most of you aren't agreeing with me 365 days of the year, right? So there's going to be episodes you don't agree with me with. That's totally cool. That's totally fine. We can agree to disagree. But the fact that most people did it in a really respectful fashion and at least appreciated the layout and the time and effort and energy that went into that, I really appreciate that. And it just showed that a lot of you have very open minds to at least discussing and, being interested in a topic. Like I said, and I said this a couple times yesterday, it's a really difficult place for Green Bay. Like there's no perfect formula. There's no perfect outcome likely here. It's going to be a risk either way, no matter what they do. And I totally get going in either direction. Like I said, all along, the worst thing they could do is middle ground it, where you're burning the candle from both ends and you're not helping anything, right? So that's my ultimate stance on everything. But I just want to say thank you for those of you who commented, reached out, DM'd me, commented in the YouTube comments, etc. Got a lot of great feedback on it, and I just appreciate that because I know it's a very divisive, hot button topic. And again, I just appreciate your open-mindedness and your willingness to listen to me really about anything, but especially on a topic like that. So as mentioned, let's get to our main topic for today, and that's going to be some ways that Green Bay could potentially pinch pennies a little bit. And I kind of did a little bit of a spoiler on this on yesterday's show if you caught it, but I wholeheartedly believe it. I just went over on my episode yesterday on what I think Green Bay should do. As we sit here today, as you're listening to this now, my belief is still that Green Bay is going to do everything they can to go all in and bring Aaron Rodgers back. And my expectation as of this point, and again, things could change a million different ways between now and whatever eventually ends up happening, but my expectation as of right now is that Aaron Rodgers is going to remain a Packer and Green Bay is going to go all in once again. Again, nothing would surprise me, but that's where I'm at right now. So, if that is the case, and if Rodgers is back, and if Davante Adams is back, and all of a sudden you have to make some really difficult decisions, we went through like all of these top end big time decisions, right? And if you haven't caught that yet, go back and listen to my episode with Ken Ingalls, and him and I go through it in much greater detail, position by position, of all these difficult decisions that Green Bay needs to make. However, what I wanted to do today is look more towards the bottom of the roster and some ways that Green Bay could maybe pinch a couple pennies here and there and really not degrade the roster all that much. So you'll get what I'm saying in just a moment. The first one is actually the one that I wanted to talk about most. So we'll start off with highlighting that one. And that's the Allen Lazard decision. Because as Ken and I talked about, Allen Lazard's decision is really interesting. He's a restricted free agent. And there's more tenders that they could use on him, but there's basically two real tenders that Green Bay would consider putting on him. Either a right of first refusal or a second round pick tender. The right of first refusal seems good in theory because you basically pay him only a little bit more than $2 million for this upcoming season, which for Allen Lazard, 1 year deal, $2 million, that is a complete no brainer. I don't care if it's Rodgers, Jordan Love, Kurt Benkert, anyone, I don't care. That's a good deal to bring Allen Lazard back on. However, if they do that, any other team, whether it be a Denver Broncos or a Chicago Bears who have some Packer connections there, or any other team in the league that's like, you know what, Allen Lazard's worth more than $2 million per year to us. We're going to go and we're going to make him a longer term deal, and we're going to front load the heck out of it so that Green Bay can't match it. You just lost Allen Lazard and you got nothing in return from it. And I think that's a very easy scenario to imagine, that if they put the right of first refusal tender on him and don't put that second round pick tender, that some team would come after him and front load it so that Green Bay couldn't match it. I think that's very realistic. So that leaves the second round tender. And the second round tender is just under $4 million. And that becomes a much bigger question because, again, as Ken and I talked about, there's a good chance that if you do like a longer term deal with Rasul Douglas or with a Devondre Campbell, that the first year of that deal is probably close to around $3-4 million. And then you start getting into some real interesting conversations as to like, did you want this or do you want that? And I think you can make a strong argument that while in a vacuum, Allen Lazard 1 year, a little under $4 million, probably a pretty decent deal. When you look at how Green Bay is going to, again, have to put this Rubik's Cube together and kind of spin everything around to get everything to line up, there's a good chance that you might not want to put $4 million into Allen Lazard. And it's just only because of the scenario that Green Bay's in and trying to pinch every penny. So the way that I look at this is that if I'm Green Bay, I'm more open to putting that right of first refusal offer on Allen Lazard. And if some other team comes through and offers him a big deal, good for Allen, we're going to move in a different direction. And to me, that different direction that you move in and probably try to get this deal done sooner rather than later, in my opinion, is Equanimeous St. Brown. He's an unrestricted free agent, but I would have to assume that if Green Bay offered him, even around $1 million per year right now, or like a 1 year, $1.2 million deal, something like that, that he would probably be pretty apt to take it based on the fact that he was a practice squad player that got called up, didn't do much the majority of the season. Anything that he could get over a vet minimum deal at this point, especially if you're guaranteeing any money in it, I think would be a pretty big upgrade that his agent would have to consider even before going into free agency. So if you can get, EQ around $1.2 million instead of Allen Lazard around $4 million, to me, that is a worthwhile trade-off. You might say, like, listen, Allen Lazard's played like a number 2, number 3 receiver at times. EQ, like you just said, was a practice squad guy who got called up and played a couple some spot duty here and there. However, I think if you look at the overall body of work this past season, the difference was not that great. In fact, Allen Lazard for me on the season had a grade of plus 2.75. EQ, plus 1.80, in large part due to his performance in Minnesota, where he had a very, very nice game. But it wasn't that different. And in fact, even more than that, EQ actually had a higher grade per play, granted in limited snaps, but a higher grade per play than Allen Lazard did. So I also believe that EQ is a really underrated blocker. And I actually think, and this might feel a little bit blasphemous, and I should preface it by saying Allen Lazard is a good blocker, but some people think like Allen Lazard is just this like god of wide receiver block. He's a good blocker. I wouldn't even say he's a great blocker for a wide receiver. He's a good to really good blocker. And there's value in that, but I think EQ can actually come in and have a very similar impact as a blocker. I think EQ's run after the catch ability is better. Now, he doesn't quite have that down the field contested catch ability that we see from Allen Lazard from time to time. But I do think there is upside with EQ, and I think there's a lot of things that, given the same opportunities, that EQ could put up very similar, if not even better numbers than what Allen Lazard has. I think ultimately at the end of the day, if you can get 80% of Allen Lazard and EQ at a third of the price, that's a consideration that I'm taking when you're potentially looking at having to pinch every penny that you can possibly pinch. Another one, moving on to my next one here, is Dennis Kelly over Billy Turner. Now, a big part of this is dependent upon, again, what Dennis Kelly can get in free agency. He played pretty good snaps. He played really good snaps when given the opportunity outside of, the 49er game in the divisional round, which is sort of important. But outside of that game, which was going against Nick Bosa, to be fair, I thought he was fantastic. He was fantastic in his time as a starting right tackle. So if some other team notices that and says, hey, we're willing to make you a starting offensive tackle, we're going to offer you $5-6 million per year, well, then this completely goes out the window. But if he ended up going relatively unnoticed and Green Bay can get him back, closer to the deal that they just got him at, 1.75 million for a 1-year deal, I love that deal for Dennis Kelly. And in that situation, I'm willing to move on from Billy Turner, save the money that you can from Turner, bring back a Dennis Kelly at a reduced rate, potentially even sign him to a 2-year deal with some void years on, a void year on that to, make that even a little bit less. I think you have something there where you could work with Dennis Kelly, get him back at a very cheap cost, and keep him at right tackle until potentially Elgton Jenkins is ready to come back. Or if you wanted to at that point, you could move Elgton Jenkins at right tackle, or you could just slide Elgton Jenkins in at right guard and take a Royce Newman out at that point. You would definitely have some options. So bringing him back at a cheaper deal and moving on from Billy Turner and saving some money, potentially, probably 1.5 to 2.5 million dollars, somewhere in there, with that transaction, dependent upon what Kelly gets. I think there's a real opportunity there. And again, oh, by the way, my grades on both this year: Dennis Kelly plus 1.55, Billy Turner minus 2.45. I liked Kelly quite a bit more than I liked Turner this past season. I know that there's some people who really like Billy Turner, and he definitely has played his part well over the course of his time in Green Bay. But again, if Green Bay is bringing back an Adams and a Rodgers, they're going to have to pinch some pennies in a lot of different ways. This to me is a way to get maybe even a better player, but at least a similar player back at a lower cost in Kelly over Billy Turner. Next up is more of an obvious one, and one that's been discussed in quite a bit of detail, but that's J.J. Molson over Mason Crosby. Now, even if they go that direction, I guarantee you they're going to bring in some competition from J.J. Molson, likely a late round draft pick, an undrafted guy, or maybe even a lower cost veteran from somewhere, in free agency. But either way, moving on from Mason Crosby and his exorbitant contract, whether he retires, whether you have to release him, etc., and going with a guy that you had some faith in, even going back to training camp, kept him on the roster all year, on the practice squad, protected him every week. There's a very big savings in doing that, from a kicker standpoint. I'm not saying it's like 10 million, but you save some money by going in that direction. And again, Rich Bisaccia is going to have to put his fingerprints on the special teams and what he wants moving forward. But it's probably time to turn the page on kicker, and I think we saw that very clearly last year with Mason Crosby. Next up is the Robert Tonyan decision, and I think this is a really interesting one. However, what I will say is if you start getting into the 3 to 4 million, even maybe the 2.5 to 3 million for a season of Robert Tonyan, I think you have to consider letting him walk. And again, these are these difficult decisions that Green Bay is going to have to make to try to save as much money as possible. But when you spent a third-round pick on Josiah DeGuara, you still have a Dominique Dafney. We'll see what happens with Mercedes Lewis. I would expect him to be back if Aaron Rodgers is back, and expect him not to be back if Aaron Rodgers is not back. You have a Tyler Davis who you found. I think overall, you feel pretty confident that you can get by with that tight end group. And I think the biggest reason here is you're not sure when Tonyan's going to come back. So putting that money into a tight end for Green Bay this season, where you might only get him for the latter part of the year, and you're not sure how his recovery is going to look and things like that, I would love Tonyan back on a 1-year prove-it type deal, but I could totally understand if it starts getting up in the $2, $3, $4 million range from some other team, especially if they give him a longer-term deal. If Green Bay says, you know what, we'd love to do that, but just based on where the cap is, we're going to have to pass. I think we saw some signs out of Josiah DeGuara late in the year of what he's capable of doing. I don't think he's there yet, but remember, that was his second year coming off a torn ACL, or the year following a torn ACL in his second season. I think there's a good chance that he can take another step in year 3 as well. So if that comes to fruition and Tonyan gets any sort of real contract from another team, and it's not just a 1-year prove it, then I think Green Bay has to consider just going with the tight ends that they have on the roster. Next up is a unrestricted free agent, and that's Lucas Patrick. I think this is another one where it's just time to move on. Patrick was one of my lowest graded players on the entire season, my lowest graded player on offense. I still think there's value in Lucas Patrick if you did want to bring him back, and if it was a vet minimum deal, similar to Lane Taylor and what he got in his last year in Green Bay. I would totally understand that and totally get that. But I do think you have a suitable replacement as a depth piece that can play guard or center in Jake Hansen. Now, it's going to take, time to figure out if Jake Hansen can be that guy, but he did get some limited snaps last year, very extremely limited snaps. Actually looked pretty good in those snaps. So I'm actually semi-intrigued as to what Jake Hansen could provide in that role as a swing guard center on the interior. And I have sort of a gut feeling that the drop-off from Lucas Patrick to Jake Hansen, who would be going into his 3rd year and hopefully ready to impress and take that position, that swing interior offensive line position by the horns, I'm hoping that the drop-off wouldn't be that great. And again, if it's a vet minimum for Patrick, that could be a no-brainer. But again, if he starts getting a 1.5, 2 million or more deal from some other team to potentially be a starter, I think you just have to go in a different direction, knowing that John Runyon Jr., Royce Newman are probably your guards, Josh Myers is your center, and then you fill in Jake Hansen as that that depth piece behind the three of them and save a little bit of money by not giving a bigger contract to Lucas Patrick. And then last but not least is the one you're going to hate the most, sort of, and that's bringing back Kevin King over Chandon Sullivan. Now, Kevin King, negative 2.2 grade last year. Chandon Sullivan, negative 2.25. And again, I'll say this again, if Chandon gets a vet minimum deal, something like that, of course, be in those conversations, see if you can get him back. That's a no-brainer in my opinion. However, what I will say, and Ken Ingles did a great job of breaking this down, if you can get Kevin King back near a vet minimum, you actually save money on your salary cap by bringing him back based on how his contract and void years were set up. So it's almost like getting Kevin King for free. And I know that some of you are just like, no, I would rather pay more money for Kevin King to not be on the team. And in a way, I sort of get that and understand that. However, if you look at how Joe Barry used him late in the season, especially in kind of that dime linebacker, those sort of roles, he actually seemed to have some value. And I think if Kevin King is your fourth corner-ish, somewhere in there, fourth or fifth corner, in a year again where you're having to pinch pennies a little bit, I'm okay if you're basically getting him back, if you're basically saving money by bringing him back and making him one of your 53. Like, Kevin King is a 53-man roster player for any team in the league. Any team would take him at a vet minimum deal and say, like, we can live with him as somebody that's on our 53-man roster as our fifth or sixth corner. A guy who can play some special teams, can play some corner, has played in the slot, has played some dime, has played, they've used him all around. So I think if you can actually save money on the cap by keeping Kevin King, I think you go in that direction rather than paying money to bring back a Chandon Sullivan. That is going to do it for me today. I know these decisions aren't easy. They're always hot button topics. So again, appreciate your open-mindedness and thank you for joining me. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all new topic and an all new episode. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.